Wow, I probably have forgotten more of the things that you mentioned that I said I did than I've actually accomplished. That was a very long list. It must have been written by someone else. But I'm thrilled to be here this morning. I will walk through a presentation relatively quickly because I want to preserve a little bit of time for questions, comments, observations from those of you in the audience. Maybe one more just quick piece of background on Boston Consulting Group and the study, and frankly the reason that I'm standing here today. Basically, the Boston Consulting Group has a long history of tackling big, challenging problems. In fact, we have some of our alums here, Don and Bruce from Pyrotech. When we started a Seattle office 2 years ago, we made a commitment to ourselves and to the city and to the region that we would be part of the community and that we would take a pretty large portion of our time, which is normally spent helping clients make money and expand and grow, and invest in the community. And we spent about 2-3 weeks talking to some of the thought leaders in Seattle and the Puget Sound region, and almost to an individual, when we asked them what should we go tackle, the number one topic was a Venn diagram between jobs and the skills required for those jobs and education, particularly in STEM. So we thought we were onto something. We since then have done project work helping both the Washington Roundtable, looking at the skills gap in the state of Washington, which I'll comment on in a second, but then also importantly looking at economic development for the region. And one of the things that popped from the economic development work in the region was a very, very clear problem for the Seattle region, but it actually extends to many other regional city plus economic activity centers, which is homegrown talent was not being generated in a way that had the right skill sets for the jobs within the region. And I'll talk about that in Seattle in a second. The skills gap study really was the starting point for exposing this issue. What we found, and this is from work back in 2012, was that the state of Washington had about 25,000 jobs that could not be filled, which basically meant they were sitting on job boards or searches were out for greater than 3 months. We talked to employers across the state and found that that number, if not addressed, would actually double over 5 years, which means we're adding 5,000 new jobs that couldn't be filled in the state every year. Now, of course, this is fictitious. As you know, those of you who run companies or are part of companies, you don't wait for the talent to show up. You go somewhere else. And that is exactly what was happening. We talked to startups in the Seattle region. 40% of startups in the last 2 years, 2010 to 2012, had started new projects, new operations, or new development centers outside of the state of Washington, or at least outside of Seattle, because they could not get access to the right talent in the region. So essentially, the old adage had been that we could get away with importing talent, but what was actually happening is that Seattle, yes, was importing talent, but it was exporting growth. And the problem was the competitiveness for this talent has gone up dramatically. 10 years ago, there were only a couple of hubs for technology jobs. You're in Silicon Valley, you're in Seattle, there's a burgeoning little piece of a startup community down in Austin, and tiny communities in Silicon Alley and down in LA. Now you have Austin, you have Tel Aviv. You have global competition for talent. Seattle imports 25,000 college degreed graduates per year for jobs. That number used to be great because it would only lose 16,000, 17,000. Now that number of losses is 22,000, and it's growing faster than the number that are actually in place. So we came to a conclusion. Yes, we import jobs and export growth. Statewide, we do have great jobs, but importantly, our talent is not filling many of them. And lastly, when we looked at the data and we found a wide bifurcation between income and wealth levels in the state, and found, by the way, that the Seattle region is the fastest growing city region in the country in what's called the Gini index, or the Gini coefficient, which is basically a measure of the distribution of income, which basically says the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, the middle is collapsing, more so in Seattle than in any other city in the United States. In fact, 15 years ago, Seattle looked a lot like a typical European city. Now it is fast on its way to eclipsing New York City as the US's most divergent income and wealth city in the United States. Now, obviously, this has repercussions in places outside of Seattle in terms of both the opportunity and the educational achievement of our kids. So we asked a very fundamental question, working with Washington STEM, the Washington State Opportunity Scholarship, and Thrive for Five. What's going on in our state? Where are the leaks in the STEM pipeline? Why are we not producing enough kids for the jobs here in state so that we don't have to import, whether it's from in the country or H-1B visa imports, to fill our great jobs? So I'll just walk through some of our findings on the pipeline side. We essentially took a look at every cohort that enters the educational system in the state of Washington. And a cohort is basically a kindergarten class. Now the number is about 80,000 or 85,000, somewhere in that ballpark, kids per year who enter a kindergarten class. And we ask, at the end of their educational pipeline, how many of them end up in STEM jobs here in the state of Washington? So that's the math that we did. And then importantly, where do they drop out? Where are the chokeholds or choke points within the pipeline? So just for simplicity of math, let's assume we have 100 kids born ready to learn. The first point that I would make is, of those 100, only 65 of them will enter kindergarten actually prepared for kindergarten learning experiences. Now, that doesn't mean that they're already dropping out of this pipeline, it just means that they start with a disadvantage. So early learning, pre-K, etc., not getting to 100%. They're still in the pipeline. However, the big drop-off is at the end of the 12th grade pipeline. How many kids graduate STEM competent? Now, it doesn't mean that they are STEM focused, STEM competent, which essentially means, can they do 10th grade math, really? There are other measures that we looked at as well. That number is only 40%. Now you start to ask, where are the pipeline problems before that? And the data is a little bit unclear, to be honest. But there are some pointers. There are suggestions, certainly in the early years, 3rd, 4th grade, where some kids actually make a choice to turn off or to move away from STEM as an interest area. Math skills start to drop off precipitously, getting up to 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And a key determinant in 8th grade, are you taking and passing algebra? Another big choke point. So 40 of those kids are actually graduating from high school here in the state competent. A decent number drop off as well when we say how many of them show up as freshmen here in the state of Washington. Now some of them go to other schools, but interestingly, of those who are STEM capable, who graduate from college, 75% of them would like to pursue a STEM degree here in the state of Washington, and not all of them can. So here we start to run into a very, very big problem in Western Washington, but it's repeated in other universities, which is STEM capacity, STEM degree capacity in universities is not high enough, particularly in expensive to serve areas that have heavy lab components, whether it be engineering, medical sciences, or computer science. And I'm sure all of you have heard the data on the University of Washington's numbers in computer science and engineering, where they turn away 50–60% of kids who are qualified for those programs today because there's not enough capacity. So 22 of those kids are still left in our pipeline. Only 13 graduate. And when we say graduate, this is 6 years to complete a 4-year degree or 4 years to complete a 2-year degree in STEM. Of those 13, 9 then actually pursue jobs here in the state. Now this is actually good news, which is if we produce local folks here in the state, they tend to get jobs here and stay here. So back to that 25,000, 22,000 talent war that we've been having for decades, this war is a heck of a lot easier. Now, how good is this? How bad is this? Let's look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts is always held up as probably the icon for early learning and development of K through 12 education here in the state. It has the best math outcome scores and I think second best in reading scores. Compared to us here in Washington, 60 of the kids in Massachusetts actually graduate 12th grade STEM capable. 60 go on, 38 entering Massachusetts schools, 22 who graduate, and then 18 or double the number of kids produced. Now Massachusetts is a state about the same size in terms of population. They have 80,000 kids going through as well, and they produce twice as many STEM employees in the state amongst their native population. Now this is in addition to having some of the world's greatest universities in state that import and draw talent in. So you can imagine what the multiplier effect is on talent in the state. Now, if you take it one step further and say, if you take the best of the United States, which is essentially taking Massachusetts early learning and K-12 educational system and matching it to California's higher education system, if there was such a state that could afford such a great end-to-end pipeline, and maybe it is Washington, actually, not today. But if you were to combine them, numbers pop even more, which basically says it is theoretically possible today, marrying the best of Massachusetts and California, to triple our current outcomes here in the state of Washington. Now, that is one part of the story. Just back up. The other part of the story is these are all averages. And the real question comes back to one of social justice, which I skipped over in the beginning, and the bifurcation of income here in the state and certainly in the Seattle region. And there's a fundamental question, which is, in a world where middle-skill jobs are on the decline, where manufacturing jobs are on the decline, how are we going to create 2.5, 3 times living wage jobs in the state of Washington? And I would posit that one of the greatest opportunities is STEM, which makes it not only a great economic development lever, but also a great social justice lever, and perhaps one of the strongest. Now, the data in Washington is, to me, pretty compelling. The data you see up here is basically for higher income kids, so the top quartile of kids today in terms of the income level of their families and how they perform in the pipeline. The data is not exactly comparable to the last slide, but essentially 20% of higher income kids actually make it through. So a little over 2 times the number that we saw for the population overall. This is the achievement gap. So this is the bottom quartile. Low income students, so they are from families in the bottom quartile of income. The K-12 achievement, so essentially 10th grade math plus in STEM, is less than half. And it filters through the rest of this, such that you are 1/3 as likely to make it through a STEM program here in the state if you are from a low-income family versus a high-income family. So again, a massive opportunity to improve overall for the state, but also to create opportunities for those who really have generational opportunities to bend the curve or actually dislocate the curve for their own family income. And in fact, the data is pretty obvious, but the difference in lifetime income between the average STEM worker and the average non-STEM worker in the state of Washington is $1.6 million in lifetime earnings. It's a little bit less for 2-year technical university, but it's still north of $1 million of lifetime earning differential on average in the state of Washington. So, how do you fix it, and how much does it cost, and how would you possibly do that in the budget constraints in this environment? So we basically looked at all of the efforts that we've seen work in other states, and we asked the question of what if we fix some of these elements here in the state of Washington. Now, there's some things you can't get around. I mean, university capacity is probably the quickest fix to get more folks through the pipeline, but it's also one of the most expensive. If you go talk to the University of Washington or Washington State, frankly, I was an English major, and I now know in retrospect that as an English major, I was subsidizing the science programs and the science students in my university. But where we landed is that basically to solve the skills gap and to more or less double the capacity or the output of our system would cost somewhere around $650 million per year. Now, that number goes down over time because some of that is actual investment in infrastructure that you pay early on and then it pays off over time. But basically, that creates north of 8,000 incremental jobs per cohort in STEM. And if you think back to the skills gap, there are 25,000 jobs that couldn't be filled, that number going to 50,000, which means we're adding 5,000 a year. So this would get us back to surplus on a year-over-year basis. It'd give us 10 years to work through the backlog or something along those lines. And then, frankly, we'll be in a world where we have some of the best human capital and companies will be coming here, as opposed to worrying about where they're going to launch new operations outside of the state. I mentioned the impact on individuals, but the impact on economic development and actually on the tax payouts. So what is the return of this? Are just unbelievable. Frankly, there's a seven-fold return for that $650 million investment. Seven-fold return. From my experience, frankly, there are very few instances where public policy and public investment can return anything like that over a 30-year period of time. So at least our take, after having worked on this for a little more than a couple of years, frankly, is a couple of things. First of all, there's no reason why the state of Washington cannot lead this country. And I go back to Massachusetts. In 1993, a group of business leaders, not the governor, not even educators really, a group of business leaders got together and said, we're going to change this. They put together a package of bills that they worked through with their legislators, got a ton of support behind reform, behind incremental funding, and behind a series of programs that just worked. And it's not that hard to envision what Massachusetts did. I mean, they doubled the blocks of reading and math. They took their best teachers in every school district, particularly in Boston, and put them in the worst performing schools. They raised the standards for teachers and principals. From 1993 to a couple of years ago, Massachusetts had an incremental $34 billion of spending on education above the normal trend line of growth from other states, $34 billion. And the outcomes are what you saw a little bit earlier. So I would just say, though, there's no reason why Washington cannot lead because A, the jobs are here, there is demand from employers, the payoff is 7x for the state of Washington, meaning even if that $650 million was all funded by taxpayers, by the legislature, there would be a 7x return. So in any case, I don't think there's anything stopping, but others are doing better. There's one big problem in the way, which is university capacity. The other thing that is tough is that the entire pipeline needs to be fixed. And the further back you go in the pipeline, the longer it's going to take to get impact, and the harder it is to actually get to outcomes. However, it is quite a bit cheaper to do that than building new buildings. So I guess I would leave you with just one thought, and one thought only, if you can take anything from this, which is we at BCG fundamentally believe that here in the state of Washington, there is no better economic development opportunity, nor a better opportunity to drive social justice than to create STEM opportunities for our kids to ensure that they are graduating at least from 12th grade STEM capable and building institutions and capacity here in the state, either traditional or non-traditional. Community college, 4-year, new programs online, think of DigiPen in the Seattle region for game development, that allows us to get our kids through the pipeline and into the great jobs that we have here in the state. Maybe I'll stop there. Questions? Comments? Don, please.
I have a question. You say it's going to cost $650 million. We have a massive budget already allocated for education. Instead of an additional $650, do you think we can reallocate some of those funds towards this?
It's a great question. The question was, we have a budget deficit, we have massive investments in education, couldn't we reallocate? Part of the reason that we jumped on working with Patrick, with Washington State Opportunity Scholarship and others, was because of McCleary. We saw McCleary as an opportunity to change the discussion in Olympia around where investments should go. And absolutely, there are opportunities to bend investment dollars towards things that actually will have high payoff here. Now, it's also a challenge, as you might imagine, having this dialogue, because there's a side of this discussion that feels like employers stepping into domains that they shouldn't in educational policy. There is a sense that when you start with skills gap and jobs, we're somehow dirtying the education discussion. And I've had that question directed very clearly to me in many domains. But I would hold steadfast to the idea that, you know, look outside of the state of Washington. I mentioned this earlier to someone. In Estonia, kindergartners are learning the basics of computer science. They're learning logic. They're learning algorithms. They're not coding and keyboarding. They're learning things that are the foundation of the way a brain will process a new language in computer science. So I think there are huge opportunities to bend both funding and, frankly, to do a number of things that actually don't cost that much, that aren't the expensive part of the $650 million. Teacher education, getting a couple of great STEM teachers into a school fundamentally changes the trajectory of that school. A talent in STEM attracts other A talent in STEM at the teacher level, changes the discourse within a community. So I think there's a lot that can be done within the current policy. I would love if $500 million of McCleary actually was driven by policies to get the STEM outcomes that we're talking about here. Please.
Back in 1983, Washington Roundtable did an extensive study on K-12 education, and they came up with a proposal for pre-K early education and presented it to the legislature, who were laughed out of the legislature because they couldn't understand why the business community would be interested in early education. Subsequently, Booth Gardner formed the Blue Ribbon Commission on K-12 in about 1989 to 90 that went on for 22 months to examine the K-12 system with the idea that maybe there should be some performance standards and that there should be some focus on what is now STEM education. That report got immediately shelved. So my question is, we can talk about all this stuff, but is anyone really talking about the structure and the delivery of the K-12 system in this state? And maybe that's the real problem, because there's already been some extensive studies that go back over 30 years with respect to this very question that you're talking about, and very little has been done.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'll tell you, I spend time with private investors who are philanthropists who would like to invest in this space, and all of them say the same thing. Why would I put my good money into this big pit of the K-12 educational system that's going to get sucked up and dispersed, et cetera, which is a different version of the same, which is you frankly run into either legislative inaction, or you run into actual resistance within school districts. I would say the following, which is there are pilots and examples here in the state of Washington that are phenomenally successful. And at least if I were trying to chip at this, I would say the best way to chip at it is to get 6 or 7 of these pilot examples. And I'll take the Seattle Teacher Residency Program as one of those examples, where great teachers are put into school districts for periods of time. In fact, there's a principal version of this that's been deployed in many areas as well, very successfully. And this is done within a school district in 5 or 6 schools repeatedly, and it shows unbelievable outcomes for the kids in those classes and actual halo effect for other kids around it. It's just one example of probably 10 or 15 that I think have shown some real traction that today are being funded largely by private initiatives in conjunction with school districts that are ready to change. And I think that if I were going to Olympia, I would make the pitch for funding the scaling out of 10, 12, maybe 5, 7 of these types of initiatives that have been proven to work, rather than going down the path of reassessing the system overall, which I do agree has substantial problems. But fixing it all at once as opposed to fixing it, proving something that works, and then scaling it is probably the only practical way to move forward. Please.
Hi, I'm Angela Jones with Private Charter School, and I'm wondering, I'm stuck on that little point about the show points. Similar to his question around the structure, I'm wondering how have people in some of the most successfully worked with not just public school districts, but charter schools, but also transitioning to higher education, because it seems like there isn't a need for these reforms. So that's something you guys are doing as well. All of the systems working together, not just one system.
When you say system, what? Yes.
I was a higher education employee for 14 years, and if all of those experiences we never worked together.
Yeah.
Not all of the systems, but we won't look at.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. I'm also not sure how to solve it exactly. I do think there are some things that actually help. The bridging to higher education and to careers is a very interesting opportunity, I think, for the private sector to get integrated into some of these areas as well. And the example that I would use is work being done, for instance, Aviation High School, Boeing back in Seattle. But it's a broader point of the ability for private sector to have employees talk about great opportunities, career opportunities with students and parents in 7th, 8th grade range. That dialogue doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen in one critical way, which is to say what skill sets, what education, what experiences do you need to have to be part of that workforce that you aspire to. The plus $1.6 million lifetime earnings type opportunities in STEM-related fields. So I think there is one big opportunity, which is how do employers actually interject themselves at critical points, 7th, 8th grade, where people are trying to decide whether they fall out from math and STEM and take simpler classes in high school, and then again in 10th, 11th grade, when people are making decisions around college, community college, and technical school opportunities, to actually talk about the jobs in a real way, and not be ashamed about having job conversations with 7th graders. 7-year-olds maybe a little bit early. Although I've told my 5-year-old wants to be a man who does wood chipping right now, so in any case, it doesn't address your question dead on, but I think the private sector being a unifying voice for opportunity for kids, regardless of private school, public school, charter school, etc., is one important angle. Yes, one more, and then I think I'm getting the hook over here. Please.
I think one of the things that kind of follow up to the last one, and for example, Aviation High School, sometimes we forget about the not-for-profit things like science centers and museums that can help leverage and broker between those different systems. And even Aviation High School, which was leveraged a lot by the Museum of Flight, well, I happen to be their education director, that made that happen. Even though it took many years, a lot of time, it was literally because of the Museum of Flight kind of being the center of the network to put that together that allowed that to happen. And so these not-for-profit entities, such as Bowie Science Center and Children's Museum and Museum of Flight, can also be a part of that system that helps those other systems prepare.
Very well said. Couldn't agree more. Great. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it.